Peace and righteousness, family. I go by the name Kemet Sepsaru, and this is the first video installment of my new YouTube channel called Ears to the Streets. Now, I know it's been a long time coming. I was supposed to start this channel a few years back, but as I got started on it, I realized that I just wasn't worthy yet. I consider myself a neo-historian of black history, and I have to put the neo in front of historian because in the world of scholarship, you are not considered a true historian until you have at least 20 years of research and work in whatever particular field your interest lies. So, I didn't want to come off as being robotic or amateur, so I decided to give myself a few more years to study, which proved to be the right thing because I have since changed my views on a lot of things that I subscribed to when I first began studying and researching. But now, without further ado, let's get into it. I always thought my first video would be some profound explanation of racism in general, breaking it down as a system rather than just actions by white people. But, the universe works in mysterious ways, and turns out that, because of recent events, my first video is now going to be a review of this movie, Harriet, which is supposed to be a biopic of the life of one of our most beloved icons and deities in black history, the Queen Warrior Harriet Tubman. I initially was boycotting this movie and had no interest in seeing it. First, because the leading actress, Cynthia Erivo, is not a black American, and this story is a black American story. And not just because of that, of course, but in past tweets, Cynthia Erivo has spoken disdain for black Americans on social media, mocking our culture, such as the way we speak, our slang, calling us ghetto and living in roach-infested houses, etc., etc. Also, once I heard that there was a black antagonist in the movie, I felt that was totally disrespectful to Harriet Tubman and our ancestors in general, which I will explain later. But as the movie came out, I saw that some prominent black people that I respect, such as Michael Eric Dyson, Mark Lamont Hill, and even some of my friends on social media started giving this movie good reviews and praise in spite of the black villain and blatant disrespectful historical inaccuracies, even giving excuses for these disrespectful inaccuracies. So I said, other accounts that I had was of people that didn't watch the movie. They just went by reviews and stuff. So I said, let me give this movie a chance and watch it because maybe those accounts are wrong, or maybe they changed some things. So I watched the movie and I see how they got y'all. In true white supremacy fashion, they hit y'all with the old bait and switch, mixing a lot of truth with just as much or more bullshit. I watched the movie and the first maybe 20 to 30 minutes of the movie was pretty much on point historically, with a couple of very powerful scenes to get your guards down. It started with the scene of Harriet Tubman having a blackout episode due to seizures she suffered after receiving a brain injury at age 13 when one of her slave masters threw a 2-pound metal object at another slave trying to flee. And Harriet Tubman kind of stepped into that, fight or whatever, and she caught the metal object in the forehead, cracking her skull, giving her a lifelong brain injury, which caused her to have seizures, in which during these seizures, she would black out and have visions of her sister being sold. And according to her, she would be able to talk to God, and God will talk back to her. Now, all of this is historically accurate based on her own words. Now, the next important scene in the beginning of the movie was when the preacher was on the porch in front of the white slave masters preaching from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5 to the slaves, which reads, "Honor thy earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Now, of course, we saw that while the pastor was reading that verse, Harriet kind of turned away and looked at her husband like, man, it's some bullshit, which, gave the indication that this movie was taking a shot at blacks being forced into Christianity and being subdued by Christianity to believe that slavery was predestined by God himself. And they also showed some of the light brutality of slavery, as in the scene with the young grandson, his name was Gideon Brodus, The scene where he slapped the shit out of Harriet Tubman after she got flipped with him. Also taking another shot at Christianity when the young slave master gave that dialogue about how much he hated when she prayed. Now, the next scene that stood out to me, and I'm pretty sure everybody else, and the scene that I think was the most powerful scene in the movie, is when Harriet was cornered on that bridge after she escaped, and the young slave master kind of gave that dialogue trying to get her to come back, saying that he wasn't going to sell her and that her life would be good if she came back, and she kind of sat on the edge of the bridge and looked at the slave master and looked at the water and looked back at the slave master and said, "I will be free or die," before she jumped into the rapid waters and onto freedom. Now, that line was based on words spoken in a book called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman by author Sarah Hopkins Bradford. Now, Sarah Hopkins Bradford actually interviewed Harriet Tubman, and in the book, Tubman is quoted as saying, "There are two things I have a right to, liberty or death. I will either have one or the other." And the last powerful or, truthfully educational scene that I want to talk about at the beginning of the movie is the scene after she escaped to Philadelphia, and she was sitting down with Mr. Steele, and Mr. Steele asked her, does she want to change her name? Now, I think that was important that they showed this scene because it is historically accurate that a lot of slaves did change their surnames after reaching freedom, especially after emancipation. So a lot of black people last names today are actually not their slave names, contrary to popular belief. But after reaching freedom or emancipation, slaves did use many methods to find new names for themselves and their families. One method was names that were made up based on English words marking their freedom, such as Freeman or Freedman. You'll rarely find a white person with the last name Freeman or Fields. The next method that slaves would use to change their names was to take on words of their personality, and they came up with names, last names such as Hardy or Rambler. So if your last name is Hardy or Rambler, that's probably not your actual slave name. That's a name that was made up by your ancestors to mark their freedom. In another way, in the last way I want to talk about, of course, which probably explains my last name, is that they would take on the name of their occupation, such as Mason, Shepherd, Ryder, Cooper, or even Smith. So, the movie started out good and historically accurate. But that was the bait part to get your guards down. Then they hit you with the switch. One second. Now, when Harriet decided to return to free her husband and family, it's pretty much when they started to add the bullshit in the movie. And, the movie completely went off the rails to me. So, first, I want to highlight the historical inaccuracies added to this movie that I saw. Now, the person they hired as the historian consultant of this movie is a white woman named Kate Clifford Larson. Now, I don't know why they would get a white historian when, there are plenty of black historians who have written books and researched Harriet Tubman, but, I digress. Now, I don't see how you can call this movie a biopic and then add in totally fictional characters as main characters and false events in her story. Now, the first historical inaccuracy I want to talk about that really hasn't been talked about much and will surprise most of you is the young grandson of Edward Brodess, Gideon Brodess, which was shown to be her slave master and main antagonist of the movie. Now, you can go and read Sarah Bradford's book, where she actually interviewed Harriet Tubman herself, and Harriet Tubman never spoke of such a character. And looking at the Brodess family tree, Edward Brodess didn't have a grandson named Gideon. Oops. Now, let's move on to the second co-antagonist, a completely made up out of thin air character named Bigger Long. Now, it is historically accurate that there were plenty of white women slave catchers, but they decided not to put that in the movie. But they did decide to add black slave catchers in this movie, which Kate Clifford Lawson admits herself that black slave catchers were few and far between, and none were recorded in any historic documentation. And her only proof of the few black slave catchers is total conjecture. You know, they had to have a couple of black slave catchers because they had Uncle Toms and house niggas. You know, but based on my research, I would argue that there were no independent black slave catchers like Bigger Long, because since the inception of white supremacy, not only because there's no historical documentation of that, but since the inception of white supremacy, white people have always had the fear of the black male. So I can't see white men handing black men guns and making them rich by trusting them to go hunt black slaves by themselves. So, I mean, out of all the creative things they could have added to this movie, I find it totally disrespectful and deceitful to add a black slave catcher to this movie that is supposed to be a biopic of such an important black historical figure. As I stated earlier, the movie was doing just fine without this character and certainly didn't need him. But there was a reason they had to add that character, and that reason is symbolism, which is what I'm going to get into next. Now, symbolism has always been a very important aspect of white media because they know that your eyes are your biggest influencer to your subconscious. Everything you see, whether you notice it or not, is being put into your subconscious, shaping your mind state and reality. So whenever you watch movies, you must pay attention to the symbolism, not just what they want you to see, but the things they put in the backgrounds aimed at your subconscious. So let's talk about some of those symbolisms I noticed in the movie. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the fact that they totally drenched this movie in Christianity, which if you anywhere near woke or you study black history, you know the agenda behind that, or the fact that the movie is under and I'm not, you know, the agenda behind the Christianity thing. And I'm also not going to get into the fact that this movie was made under Comcast. Comcast is the same company that's getting ready to go to the Supreme Court on November 13th to try to pretty much gut the Civil Rights Act of 1866. You know, I know some of the, you know, I know that's going to be kind of over y'all head, so I'm going to try to keep this shit real fucking simple, all right? But did y'all notice that no white people was killed in this movie? A movie about Harriet Tubman and slavery, and not one white person was killed. I believe they did that to symbolize white people's agenda to erase their accountability for the heinous acts committed during slavery. Now, next, I want to talk about the name that they gave the black slave catcher, which is Bigger Long. This was obviously a play on the narrative of the big black man and his big long penis. This was a total shot at the black man in general. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing teaches us that the reason for white supremacy and white people's fear of black people is the fear of white genetic annihilation. It is scientifically proven that the black man can literally wipe out the white race with his penis. That's why if you look up lynch narratives during the Jim Crow era, when white men were totally fascinated with cutting off the black male penis as a form of torture and punishment. So that's why the most hated character in this movie was a black man named Bigger Long. Symbolism. Now, the next symbolism I want to talk about is the feminist agenda that was put in throughout this movie. Not only were no white people killed, did y'all notice that the first murder that occurred in this movie was of a black man killing a black woman? Now, both Bigger Long and Janelle Monáe's character didn't exist in Harriet's life. Both of those characters were made up for this movie, guys, all right? But they made up those two characters and brought those two characters together to display the first murder scene in this movie, I think, to further push the feminist agenda that the black male is a heartless, ruthless killer that should be feared by the black woman. And you will also see this displayed if you notice that the first person Harriet pointed her pistol at was a black man. Now, the last symbolic thing I want to talk about is the big finale. One of the final scenes where Bigger Long and Gideon figured out where Harriet was hiding out at, and they cornered her on a rock or whatever it was she was trying to climb up. And this scene made less sense to me than the Bigger Long character existing in the first place. That Bigger Long character and this scene right here made absolutely no sense to me. Literally 2 minutes after Gideon told Bigger Long he wants Harriet alive, and Gideon had already explained after he put up the $300 bounty that he wanted all the slaves back alive and well. But after all that, Bigger Long aimed his gun at Harriet Tubman to kill her anyway, only to be killed by Gideon, which did save Harriet's life. Regardless of the reason he saved her life, they put that visual of the white slave master saving Harriet Tubman from the big black man after the big black man called her a bitch, which I'm feminist agenda. You know, symbolism in that. You're going to die, bitch, and then get shot in the head, you know. They had her cornered. Why would Bigger Long disobey Gideon, jeopardizing his payout by killing Harriet Tubman literally seconds after Gideon told Bigger Long that he wants Harriet Tubman alive, making Bigger Long the only character killed by a white person in this whole movie. Now, what does that symbolize? I think that was torture porn for white supremacists. You know, a white male authority figure shooting a black man in the head for disobeying orders. You know, anything about that scene Eric Garner or Elton Sterling gets to you? I mean, think about it. And last but not least, the big finale. The scene where Harriet disarms the main character, the main antagonist, Gideon Brodus, who throughout the whole movie literally traveled hundreds of miles to catch and torture and kill Harriet slowly. The reason he wanted her alive is because he wanted to catch her and torture her and kill her slowly for her disobedience by running away and taking other slaves with her, which caused Gideon and his family to pretty much lose everything. And even after disarming him, he tried to shoot her with another gun he had, and Harriet shot him in the hand in self-defense. But after having her lifelong abuser at the wrong end of her shotgun, she does the most Christian Botham Jean thing ever. She tries to appeal to the white man's morality by explaining to him how savage slavery is, and ultimately lets him go free, forgiving him. Now that was complete fucking bullshit. I want y'all to go, after you watch this video, I want y'all to go look up every photo of Harriet Tubman. And I want y'all to go look into her face. I want y'all to look into Harriet Tubman's eyes. Now, while Harriet Tubman was a self-pronounced Christian, you can see in her face and her eyes that this woman was fierce and a straight-up gangster and a warrior. You know, I've heard narratives of police detectives saying that they could look into the eyes of somebody and tell that they're a killer. You go look at Harriet Tubman pictures and tell me you don't see a killer. You think she went back and forth freeing all those slaves and never had to kill nobody? Please, man, I think she would have blew that white boy head off and then thanked the Lord for giving her that opportunity. But again, this was to symbolize white people's unwillingness and inability to display being held accountable for the ruthless acts of slavery, and to get black people to buy into the Christian narrative that we have to be the moral compass in this equation, and forgive the white man, hoping that his own guilt would eat him alive, which history has proven to be totally false and stupid on our part, because we all know what would have happened if Harriet Tubman had been caught. Now, I know what y'all thinking. Oh, man, it's just a movie, man. You looking too deep into it. You just looking at it through your pro-black lens, man. It's not even that serious. This Hollywood. Hollywood always changed the story a little bit, for time reasons or just to make a better movie, just because you saw certain symbolism don't mean that everybody else saw those same things. And maybe those historians, maybe they did have historical inaccuracies, but you know that didn't take away from the real story or the real message of the movie. You know, maybe you're right. You know, and I kind of thought that, you know, maybe I am tripping until I saw this tweet from a young black woman who goes by the Twitter name at Lil Tay after she saw the movie, and her tweet went viral. Now, this young woman didn't expect her tweet to go viral because it was just her giving her honest opinion of what she got from the movie, but this is what the tweet reads. Find it. The tweet reads, "I love the Harriet Tubman movie. It opened my eyes to so much. For instance, not all Caucasians were ruthless. Some helped free slaves. Some blacks that had freedom was just as bad as the Caucasians. Harriet had so much belief and faith in God, they were one. I pray for that." Let me read that again. "I love the Harriet Tubman movie. It opened my eyes to so much. For instance, not all Caucasians were ruthless. Some helped free slaves. Some blacks that had freedom was just as bad as the Caucasians. Harriet had so much belief and faith in God, they were one. I pray for that." Now, this young black woman went into a movie about Harriet Tubman, looking to learn some real history about slavery, and left that movie knowing less truth about slavery than when she went in. And that is exactly what they were going for. Those blatant disrespectful inaccuracies planted in this movie was done so to not just water down slavery, but to actually place some of the blame of slavery onto black people. There was also another viral tweet of a white woman saying that she took her 11-year-old daughter to see the movie, and her 11-year-old daughter walked out of the movie expressing how much she feared the black character Bigger Long. And that is why I say fuck this movie, as a staff, record label, and as a motherfucking crew. I don't give a damn how good the acting was, the writing, or the cinematography was. I will not let you use one of our black icons, one of our black deities, to push a false narrative or water down this country's biggest sin, which is slavery. Right now, everyone talking about go vote. And one of the biggest issues in this election, which we have worked real hard to get put on the table, is reparations for descendants of slavery. Now, how in the hell can we get reparations passed if we have black people bigging up a movie that displays false accounts of slavery by putting black people as just as responsible for the heinous acts of slavery as white people? Nope, not on my watch. I don't know what movie y'all saw. You know, I watched it on a Fire Stick. Maybe the theaters had a different version. But the version I saw was some fucking bullshit. And should not have the right to be called a biopic. You know, show me a fiction or non-fiction movie about the Holocaust where they make up a Jewish antagonist and a Jew's life is saved by a Nazi. I'll wait. No other group would stand for such disrespect of one of their most iconic events, and neither will I. So, I have decided to speak up for my ancestors. Just as Harriet Tubman said she spoke to God, I speak to my ancestors. And Harriet Tubman would not approve of this movie, and neither should you. And shame on any prominent black person that is pushing this movie as educational. This movie is pure non-fucking fiction, disrespectful and tasteless. And that's pretty much all I got to say. You know, this is Ears to the Streets. Like, subscribe, and comment on this video below. I would like to get some of y'all feedback, whether y'all agree or disagree. There are many other symbolisms in this movie that I left out for time purposes, or I might have missed. Y'all can comment on that also. But in closing, remember, deprogram yourself, educate yourself, and always keep your ears to the streets. Peace.